This session is Docker, but I'm a SysAdmin by Mike Coleman. Mike is a prolific speaker and a reluctant writer and our Docker technology evangelist. And he made me say he is the current reigning DockerCon champion. So you can ask him in a hallway track what that actually means. All right, take it away, Mike.
All right, thanks, Mono. Hi, everybody. Welcome to my talk. Please come in and grab a seat. We're going to get started. We're short on time today. I wrote these slides thinking that I had an hour, and I have 40 minutes. So I'm going to talk faster than I normally do, which is really bad because most of you are not native English speakers. So I promise I actually will slow down now. So who am I? My name is Mike Coleman. I've been at Docker for a little over 2 years. I am an evangelist. My background is not in development, and so that makes me a little unique. I joined Docker to help teach the community and evangelize about Docker in the terms of operations, which is my background. Before I came to Docker, I spent a couple years at Puppet. Before that, 6 years at VMware. So my background, pretty heavy in virtualization. And then before that, I was at Microsoft, working on IT Pro features for various Windows releases. Before all that, I was a systems administrator. So at one point in my life, I was a MCSE on Windows NT 3.1. I was a certified Banyan engineer. There's like one person in America that gets more reaction. And then I was a Novell certified NetWare engineer on NetWare 4.0. So that tells you how long ago that was. Yeah, there we go. NetWare won that one for what it was worth. Well, actually, NT, I guess, ended up winning it. But so like I said, more IT pro than developer. You can follow me at Mike G. Coleman, but I will warn you that when I'm not at an event and I'm not speaking, my Twitter is almost exclusively soccer. So if you like soccer and technology, I am the perfect Twitter follow. If you do not like soccer, you'll be bored like 50% of the time. So what are we going to do today? So this session, and I like the way it's positioned. It's fairly early in the conference. I want you to come in here, and this came from people coming up to me and saying, Mike, where should I run my containers? Should they be in a VM? Should they be in bare metal? Should I do it in the cloud? What about all these different things? And I would always say to them, what is the 2-word answer that you always get that you never want to hear? It depends, right? Which is oftentimes, I shouldn't say oftentimes, I have used that answer as a cop-out, but in the case of containers, it really is sort of a really reasonable and probably the right answer in almost every case, because I don't know what your application is. I don't know what your business goals are. I don't know what your strategic long-term plan is. I don't know these things about you. So what I've designed this session to be is I'm going to give you the questions that you need to answer in order to answer the question that you wish that I would answer for you. Everybody repeat that back. All right, before we get started, I want to understand who's in the room. Okay, so if we could start over here with introductions. No, we're not going to do that. Scale 4 to 1. How many of you are Docker experts? You're running in production. You really know what you're doing. Okay. All right. How many of you have a POC in your environment, or maybe very early production, and you're working with it? How many of you have maybe picked a project? Like for me, the very first Docker project I did, I stood up WordPress in containers. How many have done something like that? How many of you I know what Docker is, or I've done Docker Hello World, something like that, Docker. Okay, that's a great mix. That's where we want to be. How many of you are developers? How many of you are systems administrators? How many of you are managers? I'm going to talk even slower. If you watch the video on YouTube, all those jokes are in there. I just recycle them. Anyway, okay, so what I was saying is the purpose of this talk is for you to come in, get some framework, and then go to these other sessions by MetLife or Societe Generale or whoever it is and hear their story, because their story will be unique. I'm trying to tell you what I have learned from talking to those customers, from working with customers, to talking to people like yourself, give you a framework to go to the rest of the conference, and then kind of have that lens to look at everything else with. So I'm going to start with this only because it is a common confusion. And many of you will say, yeah, I know they're not virtual machines, right? But a lot of people, they make that connection. They say virtual machines, right? Well, yes, they're similar. They're both atomic units of compute. They can move around kind of, but they have very different architectures and they have very different benefits, right? And so we're on the same page, containers and VMs are like houses, right? If you were to go out and you were to say, I need another house, you would build a complete house, right? You would have a house here and you would have a house here. And this house would have its own plumbing and its own heating and its own air conditioning, completely distinct from this house. Both of them are isolated, right? Both of them kind of do the same thing, but they're very different from each other. That's what a VM is. If I stand up an IIS website or an Apache website or whatever it is, and I need another instance of that, I bring up an entire copy of the operating system, right? And it has all its own stuff. And that's not good or bad, it just is, right? Houses only get so small. VMs are generally gonna be, a gig at least, maybe a little bigger, maybe a little smaller. But that's sort of, and then you compare that to containers. Containers are like apartment buildings. In an apartment building, all of those apartments, those are the containers, they all share the plumbing and the heating and the air conditioning. If I need to make another apartment, I can knock down a wall and I can put an apartment in. I don't have to replumb everything and stand up an entire new building for that, right? The containers are therefore a little bit more lightweight. They're a little bit smaller, right? An Alpine Linux container is like 6 megs, I think. There was a contest on Twitter earlier this year, and somebody said, write the smallest container you can write that prints hello world out to the screen. Any guesses on how small it was? It was like 64K. Like it was super tiny. Anyway, so they're very different things. And I bring this up not to re-educate you about something you already know, but to make this point, which is as you go into your journey, I've seen people try to take things that worked in a VM and apply them directly to a container. And that doesn't work because they're not the same thing. You can't treat them the same way, right? So that is the purpose of this discussion, right? They're different. They're not mutually exclusive by any stretch of the imagination. So I'll talk about customers who have moved to bare metal. I'll talk about customers who have consolidated VMs. We'll talk about customers who have moved to the cloud. That's all reasonable, right? You can certainly have the situation on the left there with a bare metal operating system and you've got containers running on it, but more than likely, you're gonna have the situation on the right where you've got some sort of hypervisor and you've got some sort of virtual machines running in there. And maybe that's because, one of those VMs is a Windows VM and you're running some Windows containers, and the other VM is a Linux VM and you're running some Linux containers. That mix and match strategy is absolutely perfect. And there's a lot of reasons for it. What was the reason VMs got really popular because of what? What was the first great use case for them? Bueller? Anyone? Consolidation. I'll give you the answer. Consolidation? Anybody seen that movie? Okay, anyway. Consolidation, right? And so that was the idea of like, I've got these underutilized servers and I want to find a way to get the most capacity out of them. So I'm going to put everything in a VM, drive up that utilization. Well, that's one of the reasons you would go with the option on the right, because you don't have enough workloads to drive bare metal to efficiency, right? But if you're super performance minded, typically we found that containers perform better on bare metal than they do in a VM. And if you're super performance minded, then it's gonna matter more to you that you've got better performance, even though it costs you more because you're wasting some hardware utilization. That's what I mean about, I have no idea what you care about. And there's all kinds of things you probably care about, right? So things to consider, right? Performance. Generally speaking, what we have seen is containers perform better than VMs. Containers in a VM actually perform better than a VM by itself, is what we have seen. That directly impacts scalability and costs, right? So if you go, actually I took those slides out and I'll tell you why in a second. So if you can consolidate things down, you can save a lot of money. And if that's important to you, that's something to think about. What about security? What about your existing skill sets? How do you work today What processes do you have in place that you want to preserve? I was, albeit a while ago, a systems administrator, and I'm going to be very honest. I was working for a company at the time, and I was focused on one technology stack, and they came in and they said, we're going to deploy this new technology stack. And I was afraid. Like, there was fear. I was afraid that my skill set would not be valued anymore, right? And so what I want to tell you is that, change and disruption, I really like what Steve said about it this morning. Disruption can be frightening, right? But to me, I see this as a huge opportunity. But we've worked at Docker to make sure that we bring Docker into environments in a way that complements existing skill sets. So if you are an Azure shop or an AWS shop, then we want to have a way to marry Azure and Docker, AWS and Docker in a way that sort of says, hey, these are the tools you're already using. Let's move those things together a little bit. So let's talk about some of these things. So I used to have some slides up here. So back a while ago, I'll just tell the whole story. Back a while ago, we did a study with HP, and we took some Docker containers and we ran them on a hypervisor, a leading hypervisor, and we put out a paper that said, hey, we can cut the VM utilization in here by 50%. It turned out there was something in the EULA of this leading hypervisor that said you couldn't publish results without their consultation. So they come back and surprise, because the guy who sells you VMs is now telling you that VMs actually aren't less efficient than containers, right? So there was this then I was like, this is ridiculous. I've got a paper that says one thing because I work for Docker, and they've got a paper for another thing because they work for a leading hypervisor, right? And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, let's be honest. So I said, let's just focus on the customer. And you probably already saw the slide if you were in the keynote. And I saw this slide a couple weeks ago, and it literally blew my mind. So you've got MetLife out there, right? And they went out and they spent a day taking one application and moving it into a container, and they reduced their VM utilization by 70%, their core utilization by 67%, and they've increased their CPU utilization by 10 times. What Tim said this morning, if you didn't see the keynote, and what he said at Ignite when I saw him deliver the slide the first time, was that they were saving millions of dollars over the next few years with one application that they modernized. And then that sort of kind of goes out, and they rolled it out a little bit bigger because for that technology stack, but they still are nowhere near fully rolled out. There's a lot of opportunity out there for them. And so when I look at it and say, a study in a laboratory doesn't really matter. And the reason it doesn't matter, because it goes back to the very first thing I said, was it's not your application. You're only gonna know what works for you when you go out and you investigate and you invest. In this case, they invested a day, right? So you invest a week profiling 2 or 3 of your applications, and you try them in a VM, and you try them in a container, and you try them in a container in a VM, right? You try them on bare metal, and you figure out what works for you. A lot of this work, as I understand it, a lot of this reduction came from right-sizing VMs. Their VMs were just too big, right? But they were able to downsize them because containers are so much smaller. And you can run multiple containers in one VM. So you can use fewer VMs, fewer hypervisor licenses, fewer host OSs to manage, right? But again, you're going to have to go through that on your own. Some things to think about, though, is that you are going to have higher density if you go with containers. There are certain people out there, and I don't know why, who will advocate putting one container in a VM. I'm sure there's use cases for that. I don't really follow it too closely, or I don't kind of agree with it that much. But for the most part, I would say you're going to reduce VM footprint, and you're going to slot some containers in there. The question for you is, is it bare metal or is it a VM? Are you heavily invested in your vSphere tool chain, and therefore you really want to preserve that because it's super efficient for you and it works really well? Are you reliant on things like vMotion and DRS, right? Or do these things play an important part in the way you run your infrastructure? Yes, existing skill sets, VMs. Maybe not so much. We've got some other tools from HPE or whoever that we like. Then I'm going to go bare metal. But you're going to have to go through that exercise to figure it out. And at the end of the day, none of this just happens, right? So we didn't go into that study that we did and just take a workload and plop it down into a container and then ran it and said, oh, look, miraculous savings. We went into it and we tuned it. And we looked at things that, what's the heap size, or, what's the CPU affinity, or what's this or what's that? What's all these knobs and dials that we have to look at? And you put the work in, right? You put the work in to the tuning, and you do it in all the scenarios, and then you will get the right answer. And I, again, can't answer that for you. So when you start thinking about, one of the most common questions I used to get, and I still get it fairly often, is containers or VMs, it's really your choice, right? Sometimes I'll tell you I don't care, but that's only like when I'm really hungry and I haven't slept very much. I just had lunch, so I'm in a better mood. But so really it's your choice. One area, though, where security is an area, I think, where containers start to introduce a new way of thinking. So this is going back to that point that I was making about don't think about the container the same way you think about the VM, right? Because you can do things with containers that you either cannot do or it's more difficult to do with VMs, right? So security, a lot of people will be like, oh, security, and they'll immediately go to isolation. They'll immediately go to breakout. Like that is the blinder they have about what security is. Well, can you break out of a container? Well, maybe. I mean, people have. I'm not going to tell you they haven't, right? But there's so much more from that. So how many of you in here are a virtualization admin, vSphere or Hyper-V? Anybody? So how many of you, if I walked up to you and I said, I want you to take that VM golden template right there, that image on your vSphere server. How do you know 100% for sure that that's the image you think it is? How do you know that I did not go in there and modify that image sitting in your vSphere server? How do you know that? Anybody know that for sure, 100%? So I had it like 20 hands go up, I had no hands go up, right? So that the provenance, right? The sort of the pedigree of the Docker image. Are they up to date? Like, what are you doing for security scanning and on those images as they sit on the vSphere server before you deploy them? Who can access those things, right? Who has access to them? What are you doing with your passwords? How many of you, managers, I'm gonna do just like in when you were a little child in school, maybe they did this, put your head down on your desk and cover your eyes, all the managers. Everybody else, how many of you have ever put a password in a shell script or an environment variable for a production system? Your managers aren't looking. Yeah, right? So it's a common thing, and you saw that. How many of you were in the keynote this morning? Quite a few of you. Yeah, so you saw some of that in the demo where, Christy was making the point about, hey, you can't have those passwords like that. You've got to lock them down. We have that built into our platform. And are you communicating over secure channels? Is the communication between your management, in your management plane, is it encrypted? Did you set that up? What are you doing with your TLS certificates if you did? How are you rotating them? So for us, when we look at it as a sort of three-pillar approach to security. And it's this idea of usable security. How many of you have ever, managers, again, you know what to do. How many of you have ever written a password on a piece of paper? How many of you have ever used the same password on multiple production systems? Yeah, right? So the point there being, if security is too onerous, if it's too difficult to implement, you will circumvent it, right? You will circumvent it. I have one password that I use for a lot of things because it meets the requirements of about 8 different sites, right? It's terrible. It's a terrible thing to do. So you want to have a security that is sane and protects, but is easy to implement and can be moved across environments, right? You want to know that everything that your app needs to communicate at all levels is encrypted, right? And that you can rotate keys, and that you can integrate your certificate authority if you want to do that, right? Ensuring the integrity of the communications and the primitives, the artifacts that you're putting into production. And then finally, all of those things are regardless of whatever platform you're running on. So if you set up a system to manage your secrets and you're on Azure, it works on AWS. If you're on AWS, it works on Azure. If you're on vSphere, it works on bare metal, right? If you can do all of those things, then you end up with safer applications. Then you don't end up being in the newspaper twice in 3 weeks for breaching the trust of tens of millions of people, Equifax. I don't know what their problem was. I think it was something about like RDP on the open network or something. I don't know. Anyway, so usable security. So for us in our platform, right, we have this idea of application secrets. We have a way for you to define something as a developer with Docker Compose, with Swarm, now with Kubernetes. How great is that announcement? I knew it was coming, and they were like announcing it on stage, and I've known for a few weeks, and I'm still in the audience like happy, joy. That's like the greatest thing ever. Still stoked about it. But right, and then a runtime that is secure by default. Some of the features in the platform, like image signing and verification. So how do you know that I didn't tamper your container? Because you digitally signed it. You digitally signed the base image. And then I, as a developer, downloaded the base image, and I added my application code to it, and I digitally signed it. Then we sent that over to QA. They verified that it came from a signed base image and a signed developer, and they tested it, and they signed off on it. And then it goes to you, the operations person. And you take it, and you look at it. You see those signatures from the base image, from the developer, from QA, and you know what you're putting in production went through the proper secure supply chain, and it is the artifact that you think it is. And then once you deploy it, you can basically have that image sitting out on your Docker trusted registry, and it is scanned every time the vulnerability database is updated. So we have a feature called image scanning. It goes out to a common vulnerability and exploit database, pulls those definitions down, looks at those images, and alerts you if there's a problem. We've got some other features like image promotion, the ability to automatically promote images once they've come out of so you put them in a staging repo, they pass some criteria around security, you can then move them into the production repo. Everything encrypted by TLS. There's a lot, the RBAC and the user stuff, hands-on labs, shameless plug. I sort of oversee the hands-on labs for DockerCon. We have a great hands-on lab written by one of our solutions architects, Mark Church, on RBAC, role-based access control. I would highly encourage you, if you are in the security space, to look at it. So meeting them where they live, your existing skill sets. Most of what we have found is that developers today are using Docker for Mac, Docker for Windows. They're using, if they're a Linux, they're using Docker natively installed, right? So we want to make those tools better, right? We want to integrate them with things like Docker Cloud. We want to bring in Kubernetes. We want to make those things so that you can develop here and put it there and have it just be the seamless workflow. So if you're an operations person and you're a cloud person, what we've done is we've created Docker for AWS and Docker for Azure that lets you deploy both Docker Community Edition and Docker Enterprise Edition into the cloud. Well, okay, so that doesn't sound that cool because you'd just be like, I'm just running a Swarm. I could do a CloudFormation template or a Terraform to do that. But what we've done is we've taken that integration a little bit deeper. Right, so if you look at something like Docker for AWS, we take the Docker logs and we move them off into CloudWatch. So now if you have non-containerized workloads and you're monitoring them and you've got them going to CloudWatch, you've got containerized workloads, they're going to CloudWatch, you've got that one tool that you were already using anyway. We wanted to slot into that. When you build your Swarm cluster, right? In this case, right now, these tools work with Swarm, not Kubernetes yet, but when you build that cluster, we put the instances in an auto-scaling group. I'm not going to do the demo today because the session here is shorter than it was in the US, and I didn't realize that until just now. But I stood up on stage in Austin and did and live provisioned a 1,000-node Swarm cluster. The guy today in the keynote there was Christy and Ben, right? You guys remember Ben? So Ben is actually our overseer cloud instance person. Like he oversees our AWS and our Azure. And he walked up to me afterwards and said, "Did you really deploy a 1,000-node cluster on my AWS account on stage at DockerCon?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "Please don't." Anyway, so we're not going to do that demo. I basically, my PowerPoint crashed right before when I plugged my laptop in. I lost all my changes. That's why I blew past that slide because I had deleted it. So the other question people say to me is like, well, they come up to me and they'll be like, "I'm not ready for Docker yet. I'm not ready for microservices. We're not doing microservices. We're not doing cloud native 12-factor microservices." And as I mentioned, I'd been at Docker for a couple of years. And when I was hired, you did not talk about containers if you did not talk about microservices. Those things were inextricably linked, right? containers, microservices. But over the time, we saw our customers and we realized that there were a number of ways to use containers. And some of them are, right, number 3, greenfield applications and cloud native and web apps and 12-factor, all of that, microservices, that's great stuff. Like that is a great methodology. But there are millions and millions and millions of legacy applications out there that can benefit, right? And so we had customers then sort of, after sort of like we moved out of this, like, well, it's got to be microservices, we saw a lot of customers saying, well, it doesn't have to start out as microservices. You can do a monolithic application, but then you break it apart, right? And so we had customers, we talked about Gilt and ING and a bunch of customers that kind of went that route, refactoring these existing applications. But now we're just seeing people, and we're realizing the benefit of over the last year, sort of the third wave, which is I am just going to take that application, I'm going to move it from a VM, I'm going to put it in a container, and I'm never going to touch it. And it's just going to live there. And I'm going to benefit from all the things we talked about: portability, performance, cost reduction. How many of you are running servers in production today on Windows 2008 or Windows 2012? How many of those are like anybody with like ASP app, .NET apps or anything on there? Yeah. You can take those and move them into Windows Server 2016 in a container. And if you're paying those support bills to Microsoft for 2008, and they don't want your money, like they don't want us to be supporting Windows 2008, you can move those into Server 2016 in a container, and then you're on a modern platform, right? So that journey. So we call that, if you were in the keynote, modernizing traditional apps. And it's this idea that you basically take an existing application, you convert it to a container with Docker Enterprise Edition, and then you deploy that onto modern infrastructure. And you don't ever have to go past that third step. You don't have to go full DevOps, right? You don't have to go CI/CD, all of that, which is all great stuff, but you can stop right there and have made a big chunk. They say 80% of your budget is going to keeping the lights on and maintaining legacy applications. You can chew right into that 80% just by getting to the third step. And that example, we talked about it earlier, I'll repeat it. MetLife got to that third step in 1 day for that application. Most of our customers get to that step in 5 days, more or less. Now, I won't tell you that that's every application. Java applications, probably really good. .NET applications on Windows, really good candidates, right? Some candidates are better than others, absolutely. So we're gonna do that demo. So you saw, oh, hold on, I gotta do this. I gotta go back. I didn't pop out of the slideshow, so then I didn't have my laptop screen in front of me. So, all right, so this is a virtual machine, and it is running this website that doesn't render correctly, but this is a VM, right? And it's sitting there, and I'm running some IIS website, whatever. So what I want to do is I want to take that website, and I want to convert it to a container. So over here on my Windows host, I've got a Windows Server 2016 VHD. That is the virtual hard drive of that VM you just saw. And I'm going to use this tool. Convert to Docker, and I gotta add a parameter in here because I forgot it. And we're gonna run this. And what this tool does, now this is an open source tool, you can get it off of GitHub. If you just search for image number 2 Docker, it'll show up in GitHub. This is sort of like they talked about DAC today. This is sort of the precursor to that, and it's for Windows. And it basically goes out, opens up that virtual hard drive file, scrolls through it, and we had told it on that line there, we said convert to Docker file, verbose, read the image from this path, look for IIS, and then write the Docker file out. So it's cracking open that VHD. It knows where IIS keeps its config data. It knows where IIS keeps its data. It knows where IIS records the different websites. So it's going to go through and it's going to look for those. Websites. So it'll take a couple more seconds here for this to run through. There we go. Yeah. So it did that. So that took a minute and a half for it to go through, run through that VHD. And what we end up with is we end up, as you saw in the demo today, on the Linux side, same thing. Windows side, we've got the IIS configuration, we've got the www root, we've got the Docker file. The Docker file basically says, let me show it to you. Take Windows Server Core, install IIS, create a new website, copy it over, expose the port. So with that, I can, of course, do a Docker build, right? I had pre-built it because, I wanted this to be fast. And I can do a Docker push, and we can push it up to Docker Trusted Registry. So Docker Trusted Registry is where you house your images. So this is our Enterprise Edition platform. This is an on-site registry either in the cloud or in your data center. And here is, as you can see, just so you know, it is a live demo. I just did this, and it's clean. So that image has been scanned. We know it's a clean image. We know we can put it into production. So come over here to Universal Control Plane, and I'm going to deploy a new service. And I'm going to create a service, and I'm going to call it Windows. I'm going to call it Mike Tweet. And we're going to use dtr.docker demos. Oh, this is not going to be good. I'm going to totally mess this up. And then we're going to come over here, and we got to set some network parameters. And we got to tell it my app talks on port 80, but I'm doing this demo along with a lot of other people on this server, so I'm going to expose port 8085. Those of you not familiar with Docker, what I basically said, a request coming into my Windows machine on port 8085, route that into the container at port 80. And I'm doing that because this demo is being used on the show floor as well, and so that port 80 is not available to me. So we'll create this service. What this will go out and do is it will go out and it will pull down that application image from the Docker Trusted Registry. It'll put it on the Windows host, and in a few seconds here, it'll be green. So now, it has been about 3.5 minutes, and I have this in production now, I hope. So if I go to, man, I hope I'm doing this right. Boom. Was that like 3.5 minutes? I took an IIS website out of a VHD, converted it to a Docker file, built the image, put it into production on Docker EE. So, took MetLife a day. They probably should have hired me. Would have taken like 7 minutes. Anyway, okay, let's get on with the show, shall we? All right, so we've talked sort of about, hey, Mike, settle down. Wow, that was awesome. What happened there? Give me a second here. I'm going to get caught back up. I flipped too fast. Okay. So we talked about technology. Let's talk about people for a little while. We're going to wrap up talking about people. So sort of distilling out what I've heard from customers is that this is what you need to do in your culture. This is what you need to do with your people. Right? The technology we talked about, but the people are more important than the technology. You can have the best technology in the world, but if you don't put the right people plan in place, it will fail every single time. So, my recommendation to you is involve everyone early. Disruption is scary. Your security people will have questions. Your storage people will have questions. Your networking team will have questions. Get them to the table early, involve them, understand what their concerns are, and get alignment on that. Choose the right partners. I joked about being able to do that for MetLife in 7 minutes. I could never do that. It would take at least 15. But in reality, there are a lot of great partners out there doing this work today. Find that partner. If you don't want to work with a solution partner, then go to a meetup or go in the community and find people, but work together on this. Share that knowledge. That's really big for me, like share that knowledge. Define your guardrails. So you'll get started and you'll be like, we're going to do this IIS web app. And then someone's going to say, hey, you know what would be really cool though? We could also, while we're doing that, we could do this over here. No. We're doing this one thing, because that's going to allow us to focus, and that's going to allow us to know when we fail and when we succeed, because we're doing one thing. You're going to make mistakes. You will. And you're going to start out and you're going to think, I'm going here, and you're going to end up over here. Be flexible, right? You're going to get benefit out of that. Regardless of what happens, you're going to get benefit because you're going to learn, right? So just be flexible about it. And sweat the small stuff. There's a feature in Docker that we don't talk a lot about, but it's called labels. Anybody using labels? Labels are probably the most powerful, least known feature in Docker. It allows you to attach a random piece of metadata to any Docker primitive. So if I put a container out there or a service in Swarm, I can say this service runs on AWS, it's got SSD, it's on a T2 micro, it's in the West region, it's running this version of whatever, and then I can use that metadata later to do all kinds of super powerful things like schedule containers and when do I retire them and where do I move them to. Do that stuff early. Use all those labels. Take all of that care. And pick the right project. Start small. We talk a lot about MTA. I think, and a lot of people believe that is the right place to start. So Anna Bellick, Gartner Catalyst, didn't prompt her, didn't brief her. She got on stage and said, you know what? If you aren't starting by migrating one of your existing applications with Docker, you're doing it wrong. I won't say you're doing it wrong. I will just say you're probably going to make your life harder than it needs to be. Orchestration is great, but start with a single app, get that running in production, and then go from there. But if you want to do a 12-factor app, if you feel like, I want to start with microservices, we've got a greenfield opportunity, great, do it. You can do that. Just as you go through there, understand there's things you need to think about. Static port mappings. You saw that in my demo. Somebody was already using port 80. I couldn't use port 80. I had to use port 8085. What are you going to do with that? There's easy solutions to it, but you need to think about it, right? I've got different configs for my production environment. I've got it for different data centers, whatever it might be. What are you going to do with that? Like, you can do it, but you got to have a plan, right? And then the big one. How many of you have ever been told or you believe that you cannot run a database in a container? Who's ever heard that? Yeah, I think it's more people, but that's okay. You totally can. I might tell you that it's not the very first thing you should do. I might tell you that that's not the very first thing you should containerize, but you can absolutely do it. People do it in production all over the world every day, mission critical applications. And adapt your processes. So the processes that you have today don't necessarily work with containers. Backup and restore is a different ballgame, right? Disaster recovery, a different ballgame, potentially, right? Don't think about the process, think about what you're trying to achieve, and then look at it from a fresh perspective. You're not like doing hot, active over here to do active. You're doing active because you have a high, that was what solved a certain availability problem for you. What's the availability problem you're trying to solve? Adopt the processes to that based on the technology you're implementing. So with that, I've got 4 cleanup slides. That's the last bit of the content. So the first is thank you. What I would suggest you do next, especially if you're new, shameless plug, is go to the hands-on labs, right? So we've got 9 hands-on labs. We've got 2 for Docker 101, both Linux and Windows. We've got 4 for Docker EE, role-based access control, hybrid application deployment, application lifecycle, and another one that's really cool, DTR test drive, Docker Trusted Registry test drive. We've got 2 MTA labs for Java, one for IT operators who need to put Java apps into production, and one for developers who want to modernize the apps. And then we have one for Windows. Check those out. Pick a project, get your hands dirty. And then please, for me, right? Not that like I have to pull with you, but share your knowledge, share your missteps, write a blog. If you write a blog and you tweet it at me, I will work to get that promoted and share that knowledge so we can get that out to everybody. That's the thing I love most about working with this community is how open it is to sharing information. And so I just encourage everybody to be part of that. You can be part of that pretty easily. If you're interested in MTA, stop by the booth. We got a demo there. So pro tip, there's a thing in your badge about like if you do this MTA thing, you get a really cool prize, but they don't tell you what the prize is. The prize is really, really cool. There's only 50 of them. If I wasn't an employee, I would be all over that. Like that would literally be the next thing I did because it's super dope. And I don't think I can I tell them what it is or not? It's a secret. Oh no, it's in the booth. It's in the booth. It's a Docker customized mechanical keyboard. It's like really dope. Like, I wish I hadn't just bought my Razor. So look out for a roadshow, contact your cat team. You can play with Docker EE. Can't make it to the labs, go to docker.com, trial. We got a free hosted trial up there. You can 4 hours, you bring it up in a web browser. It doesn't take any servers. Got a full cluster, got a little guided tour on the left. Good way to get your hands dirty without having to spin up any infrastructure on your own. And I'm not telling you to give me great ratings, but I want your feedback. You attended the session. You chose this session out of about 8 other ones. I want to know what you enjoyed about it, and I want to know what I can do better so when I come back next year, I can improve on that, right? Or the next audience gets the benefit of of that. So with that, on behalf of all of my colleagues at Docker, we are humble and grateful for you being here. This is my 4th DockerCon. Every one is better than the last one, and this one is no different, and I thank you so much for spending time with me. I'm out of time for questions, but I will take them out in the hallway, and I'll answer questions out there because I have 35 seconds left. With that, thank you very much. Have a great DockerCon.